So I'm Dr. Bonnie Wozlik, and I am the Director of Inclusive Excellence here at Penn State Abington, where I am also an Associate Professor of Education. And again, thank you all for joining us here today. The format is going to be in the order of the flyer. I'm going to start off here by reading a little bit about each of our presenters, and then let them start their presentations. So I'll begin with Roland Mitchell, who's the Dean for the College of Human Services and Education. Dr. Mitchell has authored 6 books, numerous other scholarly works, and have appeared in leading educational journals. He is the co-editor of The Crisis of Campus Sexual Violence, which was awarded an Outstanding Academic Titles Award and highlighted in the top 25 favorites list of the Choice editors. He serves as the director of the Louisiana Summit on African American Male Educational Success, and is an advisory board member of the Louisiana Department of Children and Family Services, an associate board member of Campus Federal Credit Union, and for his ongoing service at the meeting of needs of underrepresented population in education, Roland has been awarded the David A. Kahn Award for Exemplary Service by Baton Rouge Youth Coalition. Dr. Mitchell has received his BA in History from Fisk University and his MED in Higher Education from Vanderbilt University. He then went on to earn a PhD in educational research from the University of Alabama. Dr. Mitchell has joined the college in 2005 as an instructor, and most recently served as Associate Dean for Research and Academic Services and the Joe Ellen Levy Yates Endowed Professor in the School of Education. Thank you so much for joining us today. Dr. Jerry Rosiek is a husband, father, and professor of education studies in the University of Oregon, where he teaches courses on anti-racist education, curriculum theory, and teacher activism, and qualitative research methodology. His scholarship examines the way methods of researching and educational processes generate not just knowledge, but also modes of being for everyone involved in schools. Specifically, he looks at the way teachers struggle against racism, colonization, heteronormativity, patriarchy, and other forms of social oppression in schools. His work draws upon pragmatic philosophy, new materialist philosophy of science, indigenous philosophy, critical race theory, and anti-Blackness theory to rethink the relation between knowledge and educational practice. His writing has appeared in journals such as Harvard Educational Review, Educational Researcher, the Journal of Teacher Education, Teaching and Teacher Education, Race, Ethnicity, and Education Theory, Qualitative Inquiry, and Phi Delta Kappan. His book, Resegregation as Curriculum, authored with Kathy Kinslow, won the American Association for Teaching and Curriculum 2017 Book of the Year Award. In his spare time, Jerry enjoys getting creative in the kitchen and as a pitmaster on an award-winning competition barbecue team. Thank you so much, Jerry, and welcome. Dr. Denise Taliaferro Baszile is a newly appointed dean in the College of Education at Wayne State University. She sees herself as a charismatic, people-centered leader, deeply invested in collaboration, community, and collective well-being. As a native Detroiter, Dean Taliaferro Baszile relishes in this opportunity to return home to work as with dynamic faculty, students, and staff in the college. Dean Taliaferro Baszile is a highly recognized and respected scholar in the area of curriculum and cultural studies, where she is best known for creative methodologies to tease out the intimate connections and disconnections between curriculum and marginalized identities. Dean Taliaferro Baszile's scholarly work underscores the power and importance of understanding and developing curriculum that is dynamic, racially inclusive, and relational. She has co-edited 2 groundbreaking anthologies, Race, Gender, and Curriculum Theorizing, and Curriculum Theorizing in Color and Curves, as well as numerous journal articles and notable book chapters that speak to the ongoing struggles over power, knowledge, and difference in educational contexts. Her work has earned a number of scholarly awards, including the Mary Ann Raywin Award from the Society of Professors of Education, and the ARC Award from Curriculum and Pedagogy Group, and the Derek Bell Legacy Award from the Critical Race Studies in Education Association. Thank you very much, Denise, and welcome. All right, and without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Roland.
Sure. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Dr. Wozlik, for basically pulling us together. And it's so good to see so many familiar faces, but also to see faces that I have not met before. So interested platform, work with us. I would love to physically be in the same space to kind of really get it going. But I will tell you this, collectively, this panel, these, in my opinion, are your favorite academics' favorite academics. So one of the things that I am pleased about in this session is I don't have to go behind Jerry or Denise, because they're the folks that you want to read. Thank you, Bonnie, for doing that. Also, just as an aside, in some collection, each of these people on this panel, I have traveled the world with them to conferences. I learned how to be an academic from Jerry Rosiek as my major professor. And by the time I got to LSU, Denise had already graduated. But I guarantee you, this collective of folks on this panel, including Dr. Wozniak, if you would have come to LSU, and I'll kind of plant the flag, the home of curriculum theory, you will find each of these authors in circulation in every one of our students. So thank you, Bonnie, for pulling us together. And thank you for your contributions, Denise and Jerry, to me personally and to the field. Thank you. So with that being said, anti-racism, Black histories, and institutional practices. I put a lot of thought into this, and I'm really drawn to this idea, how there's a level of sophistication to the way that these things play out and they work, and that I think about it as it relates to anti-racism and anti-Blackness, but ultimately how I think about it as a faculty member, but also as an administrator and a dean of a very large college that is situated in a very peculiar part of the U.S. I'd argue there are things happening here, even today, that I would argue create opportunities for thought and possibilities, but also challenges. So I just point the obvious. At a place like Louisiana State University, I occupy a lot of firsts as far as a Black male administrator. There's never been, I was the first Black dean in our college's history, first Black endowed professor, blah, 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 blah. But that says something when you're living in a part of the country that hosts the second largest population of African Americans in the country. What does they say? That in and of itself asks some hard questions about where we are. So as I'm thinking about this, as I'm contextualizing these ideas and how it affects my scholarship activism and ultimately my administration, then I reflect back to some familiar places and familiar names that I bet a lot of you are very much aware of. Particularly, I'm drawn to an early book by Audre Lorde, Zammy, A New Spelling of My Name. In it, Audre Lorde describes, and bear with me, Jerry, because you know we've had this conversation on many occasions, but she describes what I think of as the biggest trick, the most persuasive way that an oppressive system works is it causes the people that experience the oppression to feel like there are no other possibilities. It becomes so totalizing that it robs you of the possibility of imagining a different space. That in and of itself, I sit with that. I sit with that regularly. I don't know if it translates into, sometimes we throw around this whole idea about, is there agency? Do we have agency? That, whatever that is, but that sits with me regularly. I think of it as a totalizing narrative. So what does that mean? Let me give you an example of what I describe a totalizing narrative. I want to go back to another one of those texts that I'm sure that we're all familiar with. In Mills's Racial Contract, he points out this fairly familiar mantra for America. Also, when we first got on the call, the kind of background about the Supreme Court and what's happening with Trump was playing. I heard that when we first got in. So keep in mind, all of us, we've learned this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal with certain endowed rights by their creator, or certain inalienable rights by their creator. So as that's being written in 1776 or somewhere around there, keep in mind, 18% of the population is enslaved. So think of it, 700,000 slaves. And even that kind of framing, that men are endowed, even that. Keep in mind, one of the signers of the Constitution, our nation's first Surgeon General, Benjamin Rush, would argue that you may not need to educate women because ultimately, if the blood leaves their ovaries and goes to their brains, it lowers the birth rate. And the crazy part about it is, we know that if you're educated, you spend time in college, you're less likely to start your family as early. And so ultimately, there's a lower birth rate. So think about it. There's a question, first of all, if women are educable, not to mention, are the enslaved, are they even human? And the trick to this argument of all men are endowed with inalienable rights is juxtaposed against the idea about who gets to be man, human, whatever that means, that category. So we all bought into it. We get it. We understand it. It's enabling, but you get it. But we're fighting to figure out who gets to be in the group, who gets to be in the center, who gets to be human, man, who gets the rights. So what does that mean? I'd argue where anti-Blackness is concerned, they would argue whether it is to be human juxtaposed against Black people's inability to fit the category, that's it. And we can watch historically, watch the move. It's the same people. And we can watch over basically a generation, they go from the N-word, which I will not use, to Negroes, to color, to African-American, to Black. But it's the same people. The only thing that's changing is the context that they're functioning in. That context, that slippage, that whoever is humanness, I'm drawn to that regularly about who gets to be in, who's in the group. What does it mean when you walk in a classroom? And in a lot of cases, our students have never had a professor of color. They definitely, in most cases, haven't had a Black man as a teacher. Who gets to be human? Who gets to be in the space? And keep in mind, I'm walking in a building. When I look out my window right now, what they refer to as the Indian Mounds, 11,000-year-old structures, the oldest man-made structures in North America. I'm looking out the window, looking at them. But the people that actually built the mounds, in some cases that built the bricks for the buildings, didn't have the opportunity to get the educated space. They didn't get to be whatever human, they weren't included. So let me move down and I'll give you an example. So I'm going to give you a day-to-day example, and this still sticks to me. When I first came to LSU, I was working with a student, and she was arguably one of the most thoughtful, intellectually aggressive. She was just, I mean, she got it. She asked all the hard questions. She pushed all of the buttons. And so I'm thinking to myself, we're learning alongside each other. And I'm thinking, this is it. This is why you come to a place to engage ideas with students. And so at a moment, as we get to the part about the career, then when she explains to me, she says, well, I want to be a professor. I want to be a tenure track professor. But you and I know a place like LSU would never hire a person of color to do these kind of jobs. Somebody like me would never have that job. And so I'm literally looking and I'm taken back and I'm like, what is it about the shadowing of all these totalizing narratives that's so powerful that you're talking to? Did I lose my Blackness? Am I so much the institution that even as you're looking at me and we're working this out, you can't imagine that somebody like me or you could have the job? I never want to lose track of that moment. That was a failure on my part, a failure on the institution's part. And in a lot of ways, you could ask some hard questions about what are either one of us doing in this space at this moment that led us to this? Something was missed. I want to sit with it. I think about that regularly. Okay, so here's where I'll close. Here's where I'll shut down, but I want to give you an example. I'd argue of what the possibilities are. Also, when I first came, we were in the process of recruiting students. And you've been there, you're looking at all of these applications, and we're looking at the typical things that supposedly translate into a strong student. And I'm watching as the process is happening, they pegged in on this particular student that looks a lot like the profile of a lot of students from underrepresented populations. And it's turned into a place where I'm watching the machine do what it does to select who has access, who gets to be human, whatever that means, and who doesn't. And so after going through this, and I'm new, and I'm literally at the time I was an instructor, then I went back to my direct supervisor. And I started thinking, what would it look like if we push back against this? The number one thing that I recognized is I teach in higher ed, but let me be clear, I'm a curriculum theory guy. It just so happened to be there was a job in higher education. I looked at universities and I tricked him. I tricked him into thinking I was a higher ed. I fooled him, okay? I got in, but that particular time period, we had a lot of graduate assistantships that were driven by folks that were all like a teacher education program. And most of the people that were already applying to the program were teachers with full-time jobs that would not leave their jobs to make $12,000 a year for 9 months. So we had a set of resources and nobody really knew how to capitalize on them. But I did my undergraduate degree at a historically Black college. And let me tell you what, if you go to HBCU, you know how to work with limited resources. You know how to move. I took that. I knew that if I reached out to a population of students that were already involved in higher education at the university, and they would be drawn to the idea of just the possibility, I invited just a couple of these guys. In this case, it was 3 guys in particular to just come sit in on a class. It's a community class. I mean, we're talking about a lot of things, but don't apply to LSU. Just come visit us. Just come see what happens. What comes out of that is ultimately already in place with what's called the Curriculum Theory Project. I've been trained at the University of Alabama to basically be part of a community of scholars. So I literally set out to build a community of scholars. I had resources and a community of scholars, and you know how this played out. Not only did those students have good experiences, but they told other students. Not only did they tell other students, but they said resources, possibilities, and then I connected them to a wealth of people that were connected to our community. At the time, Lisa Delpit was here. Kofi Lamote started our department. Denise was very present in this department. They knew, they read these works. David Stovall was here regularly doing work in the community. They figured out there was a broader community of success behind what happens in the gates of the campus. And that moment of building our community, I'd argue, translated to, at the time, we graduated Black men with PhDs at 5 times the national average before that was over. I personally hooded over 75 doctoral students, but it could not happen because I was working, but it was a community. That's where I'd argue that agency, building out the relationships, recognizing the roadblocks, the structures, but also not being so tied to either the GRE score or are you enrolled in this class or not, or there's got to be more. I'll close with this. The last book that I actually spent a lot of time reading, I've read it like 5 or 6 times, is a very small book by Angela Davis entitled Abolition Democracy. You can read it in a couple of, literally you can read it in probably 2 hours, probably not even that long. Real small book. In it, she talks about what W.B. Du Bois describes as abolition democracy during Black Reconstruction. And so basically he challenged the idea to just abolish slavery without providing the resources needed for those newly emancipated to be successful will continue the spiral of the challenges before. I've thought about that so much, not just what would it look like to interrupt the structure at a university, but what would it look like to interrupt that structure and then put the needed resources into space. Sometimes they're psychological, sometimes they're mental, material, whatever. Put the resources in play where the people who have experienced whatever the challenges is can be successful and then tell the story. I do not have an answer to it right now, but that's what I'm thinking. That's what I'm thinking. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And Bonnie, I'll turn it back over to you.
So much, Dr. Mitchell, for your thoughts on that incredibly important presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Rosiek.
Thank you, Dr. Baszile. I'm going to put the link for my slides in the chat. Put that in there again. I'm not going to be using the slides. They're really just notes to myself that I'm going to be speaking from. But in case folks like having those to hand, there you go. My work is, a great deal of my work is in the area of methodology. So I'm going to speak about the relationship between our conceptions of knowledge, our conceptions of social change, particularly conceptions of anti-racist social change, and how that's informed by an accrued historical knowledge of how racism moves in the world and through us and through our institutions. So first, I want to start with a premise. And I want to assert that in my view at this point, the merit of a methodology or a program of research lies primarily in the degree to which it can substantively inform and inspire anti-racist action. I'm not trying to create a sort of hierarchy of oppressions here. I turned 60 this month, and I think I'm getting impatient with the ways in which conversations about educational research and methodology sort of unfold. And that's probably an impatience with myself. If anybody's read anything that I've written, I find a great deal of power and use in looking at deep theoretical nuances in the ways in which we talk about representing our social world. I think our practices of research actually produce and reproduce the exact social phenomenon and scourges that we're often trying to address through our research. But the fetishization of theory and the fetishization of methodological nuance at the expense of actually engaging with certain types of political causes and actions, I find increasingly frustrating. And so then this entire presentation and a lot of my more recent work is animated by that sort of sentiment. So full warning, if that's not where you land, then this is not the talk for you. So I think there's when we think about the merits of methodologies, when I sit on dissertation committees, we talk about what makes them worthwhile. We can always fit certain kinds of words into the sentence to say that the value of this research program lies primarily in the degree in which it can do X. And then by doing that, it will reveal what anti-racist action needs to be taken. There's always this mediating portion that the first thing we have to do is reveal the truth. The first thing we have to do is produce a deeper critique, unearth the falsehoods that are deflecting that are ideologically deflecting our action. And if we do those things, then the plan or the need for particular anti-racist forms of action will reveal themselves. And I think that mediating sort of construct, this idea that research provides the means through which anti-racist action can take place, is fundamentally problematic, and is itself a part of a sort of white settler colonial patriarchal conception of the relationship between knowledge and action. By putting the knowledge and inquiry process in between our intent and values and our actions, it eludes the ways in which the inquiry process itself, the conception of knowledge itself, are forms of action that produce relations that either reproduce or potentially transform our relationship to things like institutionalized and systemic racism. So I no longer believe that critique is the path to amelioration. It's a necessary tool or a companion in that work, but critique has repeatedly failed us. I don't think that the old pithy saw, the truth will set us free. I no longer believe that the truth will set us free, because I don't believe the truth is sitting out there waiting about racism out there waiting for us to discover it, and that discovery will then sort of mechanically result in some sort of emancipation. It's not that we can do without the idea of truth, because there are a lot of lies out there. But I think that we have to, we need more than these mediating conceptions of truth or critique. And I know we have a room full of critical scholars, so just in case you want to know what I mean by the idea that critique has failed us, I'll just point out that every sort of theoretical framework we have, like positivism and psychological research that uses the individual as a unit of analysis, there are ways in which documenting forms of bias and racism can be really effective ways of engaging in research that can help inform our work in schools and beyond. However, when we treat racism as a form of psychological bias, it implicitly idealizes colorblind conceptions of justice, because we have this idea that if we can get rid of the bias, there's going to be a conception of the human left behind that will be free from racist bias, and therefore the work is one of surgical extraction of the bias so that we can be left with what the good, the unracist, colorblind psychology that would in fact enable a inclusive community. Marxism, for example, documents and has our Marxist colleagues have analyzed how racism is an effect of capitalism's tendency to commodify labor and stratify wealth, and how that has happened through the commodification of racial signifiers, the commodification of Black bodies and Black labor, and how that has been the wealth generated by that labor has been then funneled off into the majority in the United States, white supremacist institutions. But this is all real. There's an important degree to which the critical theoretic and Marxist analysis of the relationship between race and class has been a very powerful way to reveal and organize and focus certain types of anti-racist activism. However, it also provides a theoretical framework that makes racism epiphenomenal to class oppression, and as a result, regularly treats racism as a distraction from the need to analyze more foundationally the stratification of wealth and the commodification of labor and the exploitation of labor. Post-structuralism has provided us with really important tools for deconstructing the essentialization of race and racial identity, the ways in which the concept of race is reified, and then that becomes the discursive foundation and for the ways in which material resources are unequally distributed in society, the way in which oppression institutionally and individually is reproduced generation to generation. So that's a very important tool. That's why I say we can't do without these forms of critique. However, post-structuralism in its critique of the essentialization of race has also been weaponized to deny the importance of identity-based politics and to deny the ability to organize and to affirm the reality of individuals and collectives' experience of racial marginalization. It's a unfortunate feature of some post-structuralist and some post-structuralist anti-foundationalist forms of inquiry that it often treats the need for a kind of semiotic analysis. I believe semiotic analysis is very, very powerful. To treat semiotic analysis of the ways in which race is always an arbitrary signifier and therefore always an invalid and a fundamentally ungrounded form of identity and experience, an artificial form of experience, that type of analysis is the price that someone must pay to even enter into the conversation. Because if you enter into the conversation, and I see grad students come in having lived a life, right, of working against the grain of institutionalized racism, and that experience is real, and they're being told that you have to first demonstrate that you can give an account of that experience that doesn't reify race, that doesn't treat it as if it is a, well, basically denies its reality at some fundamental level. And that's not an effective form of pedagogy. That's not a reasonable demand. And it doesn't seem to me to be justified by the kind of world we're living in right now. I think something similar is happening with posthumanism. For those of you who are looking at that literature, it hasn't produced a sort of totalizing analysis of what racism is yet, but it seems to occasionally fall into the same sort of anti-foundationalist denial of the salience of racism that post-structuralist scholars have done. Tiffany Lathobo-King's really masterful essay, Humans Involved, which is a play on Sylvia Wynter's No Humans Involved, really points out in detail how folks citing Deleuzian forms of post-structuralism and post-humanism tend to use it to deny and to inhibit and prevent conversations about the material and experiential reality of racism, and to push that conversation to the side. So these things I find myself deeply impatient with these days. And that's part of the premise for why I'm going to take this turn that I think is not necessarily, sometimes it's surprising when I say it out loud. I want to ask the question of the ways in which we theorize racism. I want to ask the question, is racism agential? I want to ask whether it's, I'm not asking the question, is it helpful to think about racism as being agential? I want to suggest that racism is in fact agential. And I want to highlight that I worked with Dr. Alex Pratt, who's in the room today, on this concept, and we're continuing to work on a paper where we're going to talk about this and publish it very soon. So a couple of things. Why is this a reasonable view? I think there's a lot of literature, and I think if you go to my slides and you go down to about slide 15, you'll start seeing a whole host of quotes that I've been collecting for a while as I write about this topic, in which across many different disciplines, there's a widespread recognition that racism is an adaptive phenomenon. It doesn't manifest in any one way. Charles Mills, in his essay, Blackness Visible, writes that the use of the term racism and race does not implies that white supremacy is either synchronically uniform or diachronically static. White supremacy will take different forms in different parts of the world, Mills says. Expropriation and enclosure on reservations here, slavery and colonial rule there, formal segregation and anti-miscegenation laws in one place, mixing and intermarriage in another. The privileging of whites is compatible with a wide variety of political and institutional structures. This privileging is the key element. And I think the idea that if we talk about racism as an agential phenomenon, it gives us, it provides a few important analytic and practical benefits. There's so much to unpack here. I want to highlight that talking about racism as if it's agential involves recognizing that racism is adaptive. That means we know now that, as N.K. Jemisin says in her famous widely circulated essay, How Long Till Black Future Month, is that at some level, the affective and response to the idea that working class poor, that persons of color can be included in fully included in the benefits of society provokes rage in some people. And she highlights how that is the infection defending itself. This is the way she talks about it. She says there's racism is a sort of living infection inside of our social communities, and it defends itself actively. It moves and it attacks in response to the ways in which we resist it. There's a really great passage by, let me see if I can find it here, Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. She says, any candid observer of American racial history must acknowledge that racism is highly adaptable. The rules and reasons the political system employs to enforce status relations of any kind, the valiant efforts to abolish slavery and Jim Crow and to achieve greater racial equality have brought about significant changes in the legal framework of American society, new rules of the game, so to speak. These rules have been justified by a new rhetoric, new language, and new social consensus. And while producing many of the same results, this dynamic preservation through transformation is the process through which white privilege is maintained, through rules and though the rules and rhetoric change. So Alexander, many others, from Du Bois, Sadiya Hartman, Zakiya Jackson, and Becoming Human, all highlight the ways in which racism cannot be pinned inside of, when we analyze it, cannot be pinned inside of a single theoretical or conceptual framework, but always moves. And part of the problem in our scholarly conversations is if this is true, if the reality of racism is it operates at an ontological level of plasticity and fluidity, and it cannot be contained inside of these representational processes, single theoretical frameworks. And the standards of scholarship suggest that the lack of precision, the tolerance for contradiction in the analysis of racism is a mark of a lack of rigor and a lack of intellectual sophistication, then that fundamentally means that any analysis of the reality of racism will always be condemned to being less than rigorous, less than imprecise in a way that suggests a lack of competence. And so even inside of the standards of intellectual value that often circulate inside of the academy, that is co-opted by the movement of racism and weaponized against an analysis of what we are alleging is the real structure of racism, is that it is it's agential and fluid at the level of its ontology. You can't capture it because every effort to represent it is actually a part of the relational process that reproduces racism. All right, so I have like 40 quotes that support that. I encourage you to look at them. This kind of talk about racism is everywhere. There's a lot of language out there that suggests that racism even is purposeful, not just simply fluid, but purposeful. People regularly talk about how racism wants things to happen. Let's see here. Nicholas Hartlip writes, "Whiteness wants me to be its pawn so it can divide and conquer people of color." What I think white supremacy does for me is in a very personal sort of ways, it demands a sort of surrender. White supremacy wants you to surrender everything. That's Stephen Fullwood. It's not hard to go find quotes where people talk about racism itself as if it has desires, goals, wants, needs, etc. So I'm not going to dwell on that part. I want to talk about first practical implications very briefly of this view, and then maybe some of the reasons why we might be cautious about it. The practical implications is it means the unit of analysis and studies of racism is malleable, plastic, and they're fluid. It means there's no final referent. Research on racism must always attend to what the analysis does, what it produces in the way of ethical and political relation, and that if you take a view of racism as agential, which means you're never going to be able to pin down a final description of it, then analysis actually, the purpose of analysis is the futurities that it enables, not the accuracy of the underlying description. That's the ultimate ground for validity in our research. This is a huge turn when we think about it. And people are already all the way around that bend. The focus on futurity that we see in some of the most compelling contemporary anti-racist scholarship in this view does not turn away from the truth. The pursuit of the truth about racism produces relations with future consequences. And it's these consequences, as opposed to the antecedent foundations that we're trying to describe, that are the ground for validity in the analysis of social phenomenon like racism. I think this is why we see many people using speculative and narrative modes of analysis with increasing frequency in the study of racist policy and practice, in the study of anti-Black racism in the world. For example, I mean, critical race theory is organized around the concept, in part, of counter storytelling. Richard Delgado's famous essay, Storytelling for Oppositionists and Others, was written in 1989 and has basically produced an entire genre of literature in the field that's focused on narration as a way to talk about the way racism operates in the world. More recently, Stephanie Tolliver's book, Recovering Black Storytelling in Qualitative Research and Darkened Story Work. I can't recommend it highly enough. This piece of scholarship is speculative science fiction written for the purpose of engaging with anti-racism at an institutional and cultural and discursive level and transforming it, not through accurate description, but through envisioning possibilities that are different. Let's see here. If we argue that racism actually is agential, not thinking about it that way makes it easier to do certain kinds of work, but that it is, then it means these speculative, ontologically fluid forms of scholarly engagement with racism they're not fanciful, they're not unmooring from the hard realities of racism, but instead they are more realistic, more responsible, and more rigorous. And that any effort to try and pin racism down and call that a more realistic or stronger position is itself fundamentally unrealistic. Let's see. There are ways in which this connects with important aspects of contemporary literature. So I don't think this is entirely out on a limb. I think it resonates with things that are already well established in the world of anti-racist scholarship. First, it complements CRT's racial realism, the idea that racism is a permanent feature of the world. And it complements Sylvia Wynter's, for example, call for a future of creating many alternative visions of being human. She calls for what she calls the next stage of humanity is homo narrans. We narrate ourselves differently. All right. There's a few misgivings when I've presented this work in other places. There's some worry that viewing racism as agential has felt like abdicating responsibility. Some I might run around and say, it wasn't me being racist, agential racism made me do it. I think this kind of dissociation is not a new concept. We already do that kind of dissociation with concepts like ideology and discourse. The problem with those concepts is that they treat racism as static or mechanical social process. An agential view of racism enables a relationship to critical self-scrutiny that is not only an excavation of deficit and delusion, but is also an ongoing, never-ending practice of freedom. That when you point out and recognize and interrogate our own practices and relations as being fundamentally embedded in racism, that becomes an act of self and collective emancipation, not condemnation. Other possible misgivings, it can feel hopeless to think that racism is never going away, that it just shows up in different forms because it's agential. At a conference I was at, Patricia Hill Collins, no less, described it as a game, an unending game of whack-a-mole. But as the conversation unfolded, many of folks pointed out that there's a lot of empirical evidence that racism is operating like a game of whack-a-mole because it does show up in different places when we confront it in one place. All right, so I'll wrap up there. I think an agential view of racism can offer a vision of a living anti-racist future, an autopoetic one, to use Winter's language, one that is constantly retold and reinvented and renewed. And this feels more real to me, more like something that could be relied upon than a sort of achievement of a final non-racist and tacitly colorblind utopia that often is the vision of an anti-racist world provided to us by the Enlightenment epistemologies that we inherit. All right, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rosiek, for that work, thought-provoking ideas today. So last but certainly not least, we're going to turn it over to Dr. Denise Taliaferro Baszile.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. And just thank you, Roland and Jerry, for really insightful comments. And you know my way, I like to flourish a whole bunch of Black feminist aesthetic all over. So I think that's, my approach is my approach, and that'll be my approach today. I think it connects very well with Jerry's last point about the storytelling and the narrative, because that's where I have lived inside of that space, and moving through this space, in especially, curriculum studies was a gift for me, because as passionate as I was about education, I had very serious reservations about being a social scientist, right? It wasn't really my, it's never been my way to look at people. It's always been about being with people and trying to hear and trying to listen and trying to absorb and try to think about that, as a person in the world, as an empathetic person in the world, as an intellectual trying to figure out, how to be with the problem, trying to change it, but also being in it, and also, always sort of being caught up in that transreferentiality, where the thing you're trying to undo is being done again and again in the process of the undoing, which I think is the point Jerry is making. And so for me, I've been thinking a lot about this work from the space of thinking about the thing, curriculum, and the thing of being Black, right? Trying to get into the intimate space. I have always argued that we talk a lot about the way in which race and difference gets represented in the curriculum. And I have always been thinking about the way in which the curriculum produces and reproduces the very, identities of difference. And doing it in very, I think, intimate ways. And so I have splattered this around, and I'm trying to pull it back right now into a book, I think by that name, Curriculum and the Thing of Being Black, but talking about the very intimate ways in which you find yourself in these formal and informal curricular engagements that sort of reinforce a piece of, or produce a piece of who you are that then gets constantly sort of reinforced over time. So just a simple thing. One of the things I'll just share one of the stories that sort of brings me to this work. So first, let me just say something about the curriculum and the thing of being Black. There was an article written in one of the Sylvia Winter readers, and Darius Udell, I think is the author's name. And the article, I think, is called The Thing of Being Black. And he talks about this moment where W.E.B. Du Bois was the editor of Crisis at the time. And a young man sends him a letter to the Crisis magazine. And the letter is basically disagreeing with their use of the word Negro in the magazine. And so Du Bois writes the kid back and he says, you know, he's basically telling them, it doesn't matter what you call it. It's the thing behind, it's the thing behind the name. That's what we're trying to get at. And so he says, go on, kid, and get that thing, right? And stop being concerned about, you know, kind of what we're calling that thing. And so that thing of being Black, and I think Sylvia Winter like gets into this too when she really talks about the way in which you find yourself denying your own self, right? Because you're constantly caught up. You're in the way that Christina Sharp is talking about how we're doing work that is producing our own sort of absence again and again. And it's dragging us into a space where we are participating in our own sort of destruction and limitation and things like that. And so we could tie this back to very small moments into very big moments. So I will tell you, at one point I was working in LA Unified School District, and I was teaching co-teaching in a third grade class. And there were two kids, my favorite kids in the class. One was Cece. Cece was a chocolate brown little girl with kinky hair and very sassy. And this got her in trouble with the teachers like all the time, right? But I just loved that about her because you could just see her fighting in so many ways to be herself. And then there's her nemesis, Eugene. And Eugene would do everything he could to get on Cece's nerves all the time. You know, also chocolate brown kid, kinky hair. So I was on playground duty, and all the time on playground duty, they would run up to me to solve some issue that they were fighting about. And so for instance, one time Cece comes up and she says, Miss Denise, would you tell Eugene that I am not a virgin? I've been trying to tell him I'm Baptist. And so, of course, Eugene would always actually know what he was talking about. Cece usually would be just off, mixing her things up. And he would constantly make a big deal about this. And so one day she comes, I see her stomping across the pavement. He's coming up behind her, laughing as hard as he could. And she's mad and she's stomping up to me. And this is like this is the 80s. So she's wearing one of those leather medallions that everybody was wearing in the 80s with Africa on the medallion. And so she stomps up and he's right behind her, and she's furious. She's like, Miss Denise, would you tell Eugene that this is not Africa, that this is California? And I said, well, Cece, actually it is Africa and not California. Of course, Eugene is behind her, just like harassing her about being wrong. And so I say to her, she says to me, so why is everybody wearing Africa if we live in California? What is that all about? And so I promised her, we would go ahead and have a conversation about it. And so we do have this conversation, and this conversation blossoms into a whole project that we start, researching some African history, and then we write a play. And the kids I have them auditioning for the parts. And because I was just not the teacher. It was like, you were not going to get on that stage and read a paper. That is not a play. That is not. And so she gets up there and she tries out for Cleopatra. And she gets up there and she says, I am, the most beautiful and the most powerful Cleopatra, with all her sass. And I was like, come on, Cece. Right then and there, I was like, this is her part. We had other little girls get up there, another one in particular, light skin, very long hair. She gets up there and she says, I am the most beautiful Cleopatra, in a kind of very demure way. And so when I make selections, I choose Cece to be Cleopatra. The teacher I was working with, and she was very worried about it. She said, I don't think you should choose Cece to be Cleopatra, because I think, the other children are going to laugh at that idea. And I just thought, that's ridiculous. That's so ridiculous. Like, she's clearly deserves this role. And so I selected her anyway. And the day of the play, Cece gets on the stage. She goes out there and she does her line. I am the most beautiful, amazing, powerful Cleopatra. And all the kids break out into laughter. Cece runs off the stage in tears. And I spend the rest of the day trying to console her, trying to remind her of how beautiful she is and how special she is and how amazing her acting was. And I was distraught, because I was like, how did I miss that this was a possibility, right? Like, I spend all the time with these kids on the playground. I hear them throw around the word Black as an insult a lot. You Black so-and-so, or you so Black, or what have you. And there's nothing in the curriculum that addresses anything about any of that, right? And so there's a whole playground curriculum around anti-Blackness that is playing out constantly. And so in the teacher's lounge afterwards, we're all in a debate about whether kids should learn about their Blackness or not. And a lot of these were Black teachers who felt very strongly that they should not, because it would get in the way of them, becoming more a part of the American melting pot. And of course, I disagreed very strongly, because I felt like they're going to find out, because the world is going to tell them, because that thing is out there constantly, right? And can we not give them an affirmative space to begin before they have to face that moment? Because that moment will come regardless, right? It's sort of the part of the thing of racial realism and racism as an infection that continues, right? Because it's not just the thing out there, it is embedded in the knowledge that we are in and practicing constantly. So it's coming for sure. And so, we were in those moments all the time. And so I go back and I think of Cece all the time. And I do wonder, does she bump into our memories? Did that thing grow up in her soul like a tree with many crooked branches, right? That keeps reiterating itself in her life in ways that she might not even notice the connection back to that moment. But it's repeating itself in a loop, right? And so you will see this kind of thing. We'll see me trying to get at this kind of thing in almost all of my work, quite frankly, in many different ways of trying to get there. And so I even bring that into this space, coming all the way back home. I haven't lived at home in 30 years. although I come home all the time. And it is, Detroit, they have seen the bottom of hell and they're trying to climb their way out of it. And so it's a city that is gentrifying and revitalizing. It is very complex. And the racial politics and the class politics around that are also very complex. But here I am at a university that is considered a minority serving university, although it's still majority white folks, sitting here in the middle of the largest Black city in the country at 77% African American still living in the city. When I grew up here, it was 85%. But now we have 77% even in the midst of all the gentrification, still living in the city limits. This entire university has that crooked tree grown up in it, right? There is a way in which they have had a history of forgetting about the Black population that surrounds it. It is a way of trying to notice that they have been trying to notice in the last several years and making real efforts to increase. I mean, I could tell you from my growing up that Wayne State had a significant Black population. And then there's a whole period where there's very little. And now they're trying to make a commitment to work back toward that, increasing that population. But the thing that's functioning under all of this is that thing of being Black, or what, to flip it around, what Larry O'Neill would have called the white thing within us, that is operating not just in people, but at a university structural, organizational, groupthink level, where we are now in the space of trying to figure out how do we challenge ourselves and how do we live in that space where you, like Derek Bell's old woman, when he asked her, well, why do you keep doing this work? Why do you keep, when it's not making any kind of permanent difference, like that we will see the cycle come back, which is like we can feel that very much in this moment, right? Backlash is consistent with progress. And the white woman just said, well, I just live to harass white people. I just enjoy, the opportunity to stay in the game, although I know to stay in the struggle, although I know that it is not bringing us to any utopic resolution, right? And so I think this is an important question for all of us in this moment in trying to figure out how we exist, continuing to do this work in the spaces that we're in, knowing that there's no utopia at the end. It's certainly not one we can construct while we're outside of it, in order to walk inside of it. And so to me, this goes back to Grace and James Boggs, that transformation is in the process of the struggle. So when I look around the city now, what I try to see is not just this sort of the anti-Blackness piece of it, but all the ways in which people are living in it and finding joy and making joy, quite frankly. The urban farming around the city is amazing. And it's mostly Black folks who have pushed that. They're figuring out ways to live differently in the context of empire. And I think that's, that's the call of the moment. How do we live in it? Because it's that the ways we decide to live in it lies the possibility for any undoing to the next moment. And so I'm gonna stop there because I want to make sure we have time for questions and discussions, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Denise, for that. It's absolutely lovely. When I took this job as the director of inclusive excellence, somebody had asked me once about, prioritizing initiatives and things like that. And in the back of my head is always this really strong desire to get these incredible scholars together and just let them do their thing. And it's amazing when you have those kinds of opportunities. And so I'm glad to be able to not only have the space to do that, but know such people who are able and willing to be able to come and speak at these kinds of engagements. So thank you all, not just for today, but for your contributions generally as academics and then as activists in the various fields that you do that kind of work, and for setting an example for us as a generation coming up in and doing this work. I can't really thank you all enough for that. So you have my gratitude. So it is about 8 after, and we're gonna open it up to some Q&A. You can either type things in the chat or you can unmute if you want and join us that way. And as we wait for people to have some thoughts and or reactions, I'm just wondering if you all as panelists have any insights to share with each other about each other's presentations.
I'll just say my comments were inspired by the previous 2 presentations and sort of comments, because I feel like we're all sort of riding that same wave in trying to, figure out what's possible. And it's just an interesting moment because I'm working with some doctoral students right now and we're having a real conflict with the committee, because the committee is, maybe a generation, not my generation, maybe a generation after, but basically the young, brilliant scholars, but very much in this same ilk, the racial realism, the inability to, like, when we think about higher ed, the institution is the institution is the institution. If you want any piece to do anything, you got to go underground, and so it very much this mood. And what's striking me is that these younger doctoral students are looking for hope. They want to talk about what is possible. And even so, we're going back and forth with one because he's been involved in a lot of sort of racial reconciliation work at the university level, and he wants to talk about the ways in which we hold universities accountable for sort of doing this work, and that we can't, like, for him, our whole rhetoric is giving up, so he is trying to have a whole critique about this sort of the way Frank Wilderson talks about anti-Blackness is this sort of devastation that will have to, destruction is the only way to get rid of this infection, so to speak. And so it's an interesting moment, I think, to think about how how we keep talking to each other, and maybe how we keep, holding each other together in the conversations.
So that's very, that dilemma, the practical dilemma of how you navigate the personal and political politics of the dissertation committees,
Yeah.
et cetera. And the generational sort of distinctions don't always make sense because of course, you're young, you're coming into the world. It's just a cliche, older folks are, jaded, more cynical, and the younger folks are coming in with new visions, and then that creates communication skews. But part of what we're talking about is the idea of an easy hope is actually part of the devastation, right? I mean, this is like, I read Wilderson, I got some questions, in terms of his claiming that narration itself is fundamentally anti-Black. Like he talks about storytelling that has a starting point, a middle, and then a resolution at the end is just a Eurocentric reproduction of the idea that there is going to be a resolution, and therefore, but there's other forms of narration. He's pretty clear that form of narration is the problem. But there's other forms of sort of fugitive storytelling that is possible. So there's you're not taking enough time to actually stare into this and recognize that the easy hope is actually a problem. But then there's also, I always have to question myself about whether I'm fetishizing the critique, right? Like, am I pushing that too hard? And given my positionality in a context like this, particularly if I'm advising students of color, there's a whole nother dynamic to that. So I'm really interested in how you sort of personally navigate that and where you fall in that. Do you think the student is right? Or do you think the student has a little bit more work to do?
Well, I would say that first, let me just say something about other forms of narration, because that always makes me think about, Miami. I was at Miami of Ohio for 21 years, and we have the Miami Center there, which is a manifestation of a partnership between the Miami tribe and the university. As you know, the tribe was removed, the university was built, et cetera, but back in like the early 70s, I think, the chief of the tribe at the time came to Miami and called on the president, and they sat down and had this conversation, and this whole relationship burgeons. In the Miami Center emerges. The director just won a MacArthur Genius a couple years ago, but they're doing all this work around the revitalization of the culture and the language of Miami people. And storytelling, right, is so central. And I remember taking elementary, so I arranged for my daughter's elementary class to come to the university. We did a little customized trip for them. We went into the Wikiyama room, which is sort of kind of a meditation storytelling space. That carries a tribal name. And so some of the tribal members from the center come over to tell stories. And it was so fascinating because there is no end, right? To Native American storytelling is very like circular and very different. Like clearly different. I just remember all the little kids sitting there like confused because they were looking for this ending or some kind of period on the story, and there was none. And then the possibilities that opened up for the conversation, which I thought was really amazing. So it just constantly reminds me all the time that there are other ways, definitely other ways to be in the world, that we can elevate and work on as a way to be doing something important and pushing against the things that are not good to us or for us. But dealing with this with students, I'm gonna tell you what I've been doing in this situation is mediating, because I've been trying to tell the students where the faculty are coming from, and then trying to help the faculty understand that the students are asking for a new moment, but how do we get in between the intersection of these two ways of sort of thinking about the world, which to me, if you're reading all the anti-Blackness stuff that's going on in Black studies, that's what it is. You got people here, and it's like, how do we get into this space in between? Because really, all of this is happening. You know, we're in all of this at the same time, and those things, you know, they define each other in some real ways. So, and I'm just telling you, it's taking a long time to get this dissertation done on top of that. So,
You know what, I'd add to that, and particularly, Jerry, I point this out because in our group, I remember you saying this. There was a hard moment where you're introducing a large student population to a graduate program that doesn't have a history of, you know, a particularly diverse group of students experiencing the space. And so there's a moment where I remember we were having some of the tensions that kind of relate to what you're describing, Denise. And also at this point, a large group of the student populations were being formally introduced to critical literature. And so they're just now having the kind of critical race theory, you know, womanism. And so they're feeling that they're really to push back against the machine.
yes.
And at one point I remember we were having this tension, and the thing that Jerry said, and I apologize for the language, but I remember this very clearly. Jerry said to this, and Becky Atkinson is on the call, and she was in the class, so Becky knows this. Jerry said, whatever that tension is, I appreciate having students from underrepresented populations that haven't been part of the conversation in a different environment, because you don't have to convince them, quote unquote, there's some shit in the game. There's a natural criticalness that adds to a level of conversation that's so critically important. And I think part of the tension that I think about now as an administrator, when I'm having that same set of conversations, I mean, I literally just left a meeting that's happening on campus about the history of universities and slavery. And I love this idea that as I recognize my position in the university, I want people that are constantly reminding me, asking the hard questions, and don't get comfortable with the limitations of what the institution, my co-author on our most recent book, Patron Hendry, talks about this all the time. I'm done with method. Whatever this thing that methodology does to narrative and to people's stories, I'm done with it. There's something there. That possibility, that constant change. And the other thing too is, recall, Du Bois, before he moved to Ghana, you remember that last letter he wrote, I want to say in 1960 something, and he has gone from literally being claimed as founding all of these movements, all this kind of critical voice, but the same man who wrote this text that people recognize in 1906 and 1961 has become a Uncle Tom. He's not critical enough, and he literally is like, fight on, chin up, I'm done, I'm out. That kind of historicizing what it looks like to be part of the change, the challenge. I love that. I never want to lose that energy, because I do have to tell you, there's a moment where I probably have 2 students that I'm still working with. And what goes through my mind, and this is what I worry about though, is that I get to a point where I'm like, all right, you know that everything that you're doing is the antithesis to you having a PhD. How are we gonna do this? You know, how do you want this to work? But at the same time, I'd argue not being able to sit with that uncomfortableness is ultimately what got me passionate about this. This is what ultimately, working with folks from comm studies, Africana studies, literally, you cannot become comfortable within the discipline, within the institution. And the moment that you become that disconnected, what are we doing? That's it. The last thing I'll say also about narrative, and I remember the AERA, Sean Lazard, he said this so clearly. I remember this just so clearly that he said, maybe there's a moment that maybe certain stories aren't made for every community. Maybe there's a moment where that story needs to sit, that didn't need to be in this space. The power of understanding the different ways to experience, different ways to narrate, and that you constantly have to create the spaces to be open for those broader dialogues. I mean, that's it. That's the struggle. That's the beauty of the struggle.
Mhm. Yeah.
Can I respond? Bonnie, you got something else to do. Yeah, so this idea of the structure of the narratives and the different kinds of narratives, there's a really great essay by Ava Garut and Kathleen Westcott. Ava Garut's a Cherokee sociologist, and Kathleen Westcott is an Anishinaabe storyteller. I could send you the link if you want it. But they talked about the importance of windowing research on stories and the stories people tell, what it means to not just document them, not just dissect them, not just report them, but to be a good companion to the story. And Kathleen Westcott talks about how stories have a life, right? They're alive. And even if nobody knows the story still exists. She says the story doesn't live like a bear. It lives on the words, so it lives through us. So the idea is that when you're telling the story, you're not actually trying to lead to a conclusion. You're not trying to describe the world. You're trying to create a kind of being, the way Walter Gershon, who's on the call, talks about, creating reverberations, right? The story like lives in the community, and it does different kinds of work throughout it. But the story stays around for a very long time because the story does a certain kind of work. That's a really different way of thinking about how we produce research. This is why, even though sometimes I get bucked off of Frank Wilderson's Afro-pessimism essays, he's doing a performance that sits with you, right? And doesn't let you get comfortable, right? And this is a very valuable thing to have, even when he sort of edges into some misogyny. I got problems passing that book on to some folks, right? He's doing something that isn't simply telling us a thing, right?
I think that's so important. Like that's such a important and powerful point, because it brings us back to the right in the heart of it. Like, it is in the doing the thing, it is in the act of the storytelling, it is in the performance that if that change is happening, that resistance is happening, that possibility is happening, that impossibility is happening, all, it's doing work, it's doing really important work. I'm almost getting myself in trouble around here already at a R1 that has a very sort of traditional way of thinking about R1 work. And I'm really trying to change the way we talk about research to be more aligned with this. It is doing work. Can we talk about the work that it is doing, that may not be attached to, $10 million, whatever. But the power of the work that is both trying to see and understand, but in it at the same time, and also impacting, rippling, reverberating in so many other lives, because the work is in and with community. I think about this, there's this TED Talk that I showed at the faculty and staff opening gathering. And if you haven't seen this, go see it. It's called Man Buys House for $500 in Detroit. And so this guy he's from Michigan, but not from Detroit, but from Michigan, graduates from U of M. This is in the 2008, 9, when Detroit is sort of bottoming out. And he decides he's going to move. He sees what's going on, and he really wants to make a difference. So he's going to move to the city. He buys a house in what he thinks is an abandoned neighborhood. There's 10,000 pounds of trash in this house. And he shows up, and he finds out that the neighborhood actually really isn't abandoned, though it takes on the appearance of abandonedness and blight, that it's not actually abandoned. There are people sort of living there, and there are people living and figuring out how to be in community with each other in the middle of a city where the services are cut out, where it's a food desert, and sort of all these things going on. So he ends up rehabbing the house, or that's probably not even the right word for it, because it's not what he's doing, but he revitalizes the house with the help of his neighbors, right? His neighbors come in and help him take out the trash. His neighbor lets him come take a shower at her house because he doesn't have running water for many, many months in this process. And so he starts talking about this concept of radical neighborliness. And so I which he captures in his story, but he never defines, right? And so I take it to the faculty and staff, and they're like, yeah, they're inspired for sure. And now I'm telling them, like, so what is the praxis of radical neighborliness that is going to define how this college will move forward, and who it will be, and what we will be doing, and how vital we will be to a potential city where there is mixed income living in urban gardens, in urban farms, and new food sources and new possibilities. And they are stuck on, wow, so what is the definition of radical neighborliness? And so I keep trying to bring stories to them that distill down to, there's no definition, but part of this praxis is about how do we align ourselves with the communities that are making new ways of living and being in the heart of real, just, destitution in so many ways around them. How do we build solidarity in those spaces? How do we go listen and hear and be in those spaces in a radical, neighborly way? I think that is the call of the moment. If you want to keep your sanity. If you don't want to keep your sanity, then you can stay up here trying to fight the fight in this very sort of particular way where we recognize that we're stuck in the loop. And it's not that we're not down here, but there's also these moments where you see how people are managing to live in the midst of the undoing in ways that affirm some seed of possibility.
Thank you. We do have one question. I know we're just at about time, so have just a minute for a quick question, and then we'll close out for today.
Somebody must have told you that I'm long-winded, because that was a great intro, and to be already taking 15 seconds here to say absolutely nothing at all. But I just wanted to, there's so many just different nuggets that really plug into the way that we approach anti-racism at the Anti-Racist Development Institute. And something that Dr. Taliaferro Baszile said was, when she first started talking, was about this being with, right? And so I think that is also a part of this need to sort of ideate, right, around those who are experiencing pain in our systems, and how can we meet that pain? What can we do about that? How can we help to eradicate that, right? And I feel like those elements of anti-racism are what help us to make progress, though incremental and though frustrating for Dr. Rosiek. I think it's very possible for us to sort of reimagine. I mean, we really have to think about, when we talk about anti-racism, whether it's agential or not, that we are essentially trying to undo this 400-year-old system. And so there's very much, not only is it an infection that's feeding on itself, it's all we've ever known, right? And so there is a way that, again, with the work that we do in using systems design and design thinking approaches, where we have to embrace a tolerance of failure, right? We have to embrace this fact that we aren't going to get it right away, right? And so we are going to have to keep doing it and keep messing up and keep doing it and just staying at it and keeping those users who are experiencing the most pain present and in front of us, and really do our best to do the things that we need to do for the people who matter most. I went over a minute. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to share.
Thank you, and thank you for the work that you all are doing through that center. It's really important. So with that, I'm actually going to close up. So obviously a quick plug for the upcoming things. The Office of Inclusive Excellence continue to try and bring programming not just to Penn State Abington, but open to all who are able to attend. On that note, if you are in the Philadelphia area, on January 29th, the Office of Inclusive Excellence will host its second dinner in the Communities of Care series that we're putting on from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. I just booked speaker Don Palmer for that. If you don't know Don and his work, worth looking up and attending to. And if you're in the area, please come check it out. Otherwise, thank you all so much for your time today, and just for the work that I'm hoping everyone takes from this session and pushes out into the communities of which they are a part of, because it's always a community effort, and coalition politics are so necessary in the work that we do and continue to do as we work in and through anti-racist policies and practices across institutional spaces. Thank you so much.
Thank you,